The 18th of April, 1775, dawned cold and clear over the Massachusetts countryside. Yet beneath the deceptive tranquility, tensions that had simmered for a decade were about to explode into violence that would reshape the world. In the darkened steeples of Boston's Old North Church, Sexton Robert Newman climbed narrow stairs with trembling hands, carrying 2 lanterns whose light would signal the beginning of America's fight for independence, 2 if by sea, warning that British regulars were crossing the Charles River to seize colonial military supplies hidden in Concord. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of His Majesty's 10th Regiment of Foot had received his orders from General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, late on the evening of the 18th. Smith commanded approximately 700 British soldiers, elite light infantry and grenadiers, tasked with a mission that appeared straightforward on paper: march to Concord, confiscate or destroy the rebel armaments, and return to Boston before the colonists could mount significant resistance. What Gage and Smith failed to anticipate was the sophisticated intelligence network the Patriots had constructed throughout the colony. As British regulars assembled on Boston Common near midnight, their movements were already being observed by dozens of colonial eyes. Dr. Joseph Warren, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, had learned of the British plans through sources within Gage's own household. Rumors persist that Gage's American-born wife, Margaret Kemble Gage, sympathized with the colonial cause and may have leaked information, though this remains historically contested. Warren immediately dispatched 2 riders into the countryside, the silversmith Paul Revere and the tanner William Dawes, both members of the Sons of Liberty. The British column departed Boston around 2 o'clock in the morning of the 19th. Their boat crossing of the Charles River, delayed by logistical difficulties that would plague their entire expedition. The soldiers waded through marshes in the darkness, their wool uniforms becoming soaked and heavy, their powder cartridges dampened by the marsh water. Many of these men were veterans of the 7 Years' War, professional soldiers who had fought from Quebec to the Caribbean, yet they found themselves in unfamiliar territory now, not facing enemy armies in open battle, but attempting to suppress their own colonial subjects who knew every road, every stone wall, every shortcut through the countryside. Meanwhile, Revere galloped through Medford and into Lexington, pounding on doors and shouting warnings that the regulars are coming out. This commonly misquoted phrase, often rendered as the British are coming, reflected an important reality. Most colonists still considered themselves British subjects in April 1775. They were fighting against what they perceived as ministerial tyranny and parliamentary overreach, not yet for complete independence from the crown. By the time Revere reached Lexington around midnight, church bells were already ringing across the countryside, muskets were being loaded, and militia companies were assembling on village greens throughout Middlesex County. Captain John Parker, a 45-year-old veteran of the French and Indian War who suffered from tuberculosis, began gathering his Lexington militia company, approximately 77 men and boys ranging from 16-year-old William Diamond to Moses Harrington, who was 65. The express riders continued spreading their alarm through the night. Revere was briefly joined by another rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott, a young physician who had been courting his fiancée in Lexington. When British patrol officers captured Revere near Lincoln, Prescott managed to escape and continued to Concord, ensuring that the town received sufficient warning to hide or disperse most of their military supplies before the regulars arrived. Throughout the pre-dawn darkness of the 19th, Massachusetts transformed from a collection of sleepy agricultural communities into an armed camp. The 19th of April, 1775, brought the first rays of sunlight across Lexington Common just as Lieutenant Colonel Smith's advance guard, commanded by Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, approached the triangular village green. Pitcairn, a Scotsman known for his relatively moderate views toward the colonists, led approximately 240 light infantrymen who had been marching for nearly 6 hours through the darkness. The soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and increasingly anxious as church bells and signal guns had tracked their progress throughout the night. Captain John Parker had initially assembled his militia around 1 o'clock in the morning after receiving Revere's warning, but as hours passed without any sign of British troops, he had dismissed most of his men to nearby Buckman Tavern to wait in relative comfort. When scouts finally reported the regulars approaching at dawn, Parker's drummer, 16-year-old William Diamond, beat the call to arms. Approximately 77 militiamen formed up in two ragged lines on the green: farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and laborers, many of them related by blood or marriage. Parker, weakened by the tuberculosis that would kill him within 5 months, understood his company was vastly outnumbered. According to testimony recorded shortly after the battle, he gave his famous order: "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." These words, whether precisely accurate or later refined for posterity, captured the colonists' defensive posture. They would not initiate violence, but neither would they surrender their rights as Englishmen. As Major Pitcairn led his troops onto the green around 5 o'clock in the morning, he faced a dilemma that military commanders would grapple with for centuries afterward: how to de-escalate a confrontation where both sides were armed, tense, and convinced of their righteous cause. Pitcairn, by multiple accounts from both British and colonial sources, attempted to avoid bloodshed. Mounted on his horse, he rode forward shouting commands for the rebels to lay down their arms and disperse. The exact sequence of events that followed remains one of American history's most debated moments, examined in sources ranging from Revolutionary-era depositions to modern historical journals, including the Massachusetts Historical Society's comprehensive collections. Captain Parker, recognizing the hopelessness of his tactical position, had apparently begun ordering his men to disperse, though crucially, not to surrender their weapons. The militiamen started breaking ranks, some moving toward the nearby meeting house, others backing away but maintaining their grip on their muskets. Then a shot rang out, the immortal shot heard round the world that Ralph Waldo Emerson would commemorate in poetry decades later. To this day, no one knows with certainty who fired that first shot. British Lieutenant William Sutherland later testified that he saw a colonial militiaman fire from behind a stone wall. Colonial witnesses swore that British soldiers fired first, possibly a pistol shot from one of the mounted officers. Some historians have speculated it might have been an accidental discharge from either side, a musket triggered by a nervous finger in the confusion. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. British soldiers, already anxious from their nighttime march and perhaps startled by the initial shot, opened fire in a poorly controlled volley. Major Pitcairn and his officers frantically tried to restore order, with Pitcairn riding among his troops striking their muskets upward with his sword, but discipline had momentarily collapsed. For approximately 15 minutes, British regulars fired upon the dispersing militiamen. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead on Lexington Green: Jonathan Harrington, who crawled to his doorstep and died in his wife's arms; Jonas Parker, a cousin of Captain John Parker, who had sworn never to run from British troops; Samuel Hadley, Caleb Harrington, Isaac Muzzy, Asahel Porter, John Brown, and Jedediah Monroe. 10 others were wounded. On the British side, only 1 soldier was slightly wounded, and Major Pitcairn's horse was hit twice. The British troops gave 3 victory cheers and continued their march toward Concord, 6 miles distant. The 19th of April morning light strengthened as Lieutenant Colonel Smith's column, reunited after the Lexington engagement, marched into Concord around 7 o'clock. The town presented a deceptively peaceful appearance. White-painted houses clustered around the village center, the meeting house standing sentinel over the community, the North Bridge spanning the Concord River approximately a mile north of town. Yet Smith and his officers knew they were now deep in hostile territory, 21 miles from the safety of Boston, surrounded by an aroused countryside. Colonel James Barrett, commander of the Concord militia, and at 65 one of the oldest officers who would see action that day, had been preparing for this confrontation for months. As president of the Committee of Safety for Concord, Barrett had overseen the accumulation of military supplies intended to sustain a colonial army: muskets, gunpowder, artillery pieces, medical supplies, and provisions. When Dr. Samuel Prescott arrived in the early morning hours with warning of the British approach, Barrett had immediately ordered most of these supplies dispersed to surrounding towns or hidden on local farms, including his own property 2 miles north of Concord Center. The British began their search operation with professional efficiency, dividing their force to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. Captain Lawrence Parsons took 6 light infantry companies, approximately 200 men, across the North Bridge to search Barrett's farm and other locations north of the river. Captain Mundy Pole's soldiers began breaking open barrels in the town center, destroying what military supplies remained, primarily flour and wooden gun carriages, which they burned in the streets. Other detachments searched the meeting house, the jail, and various homes and shops. Meanwhile, colonial militia companies were streaming toward Concord from every direction. Major John Buttrick, second in command of the Concord militia, assembled forces on Punkatassett Hill overlooking the town. Companies arrived from Acton led by Captain Isaac Davis, from Bedford commanded by Captain Jonathan Wilson, from Lincoln under Captain William Smith, and from numerous other towns. By mid-morning, approximately 400 colonial militiamen occupied the heights north and east of Concord, watching smoke rise from fires the British had set in the town center. The colonists' concern intensified as they observed what they believed to be the British burning Concord. In reality, the fires were controlled destructions of military supplies, but from a distance, the militiamen feared their town was being put to the torch, an act that would have represented an unthinkable escalation. This misunderstanding precipitated the decision that transformed the day from a British punitive expedition into a colonial military campaign. According to research documented in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study, Paul Revere's Ride, published by Oxford University Press, the colonial officers held a hurried conference on the hillside. Major Buttrick and Colonel Barrett faced a fateful decision: remain in a defensive posture and allow the British to complete their mission, or take offensive action to protect their town. The aggressive option contradicted decades of colonial deference to British authority, but the smoke rising from Concord Center proved decisive. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, Barrett gave orders that would change history. The militia would march back into Concord in formation, not to attack the British, but to protect the town. The colonists formed a column and began descending the hill toward the North Bridge, drums beating, flags flying. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton, leading his company at the front of the column, allegedly asked, "I haven't a man who is afraid to go." Davis, a 30-year-old gunsmith with 4 young children, would be dead within the hour. At the North Bridge, approximately 100 British soldiers under Captain Walter Laurie stood in defensive positions on the east side of the span. Laurie faced an impossible situation. He was outnumbered 4-1, separated from the main British force in Concord Center, and watching an armed colonial column marching directly toward his position. He sent urgent messages to Lieutenant Colonel Smith requesting reinforcements, but Smith, dealing with his own challenges in the town center, could provide no immediate support. The colonial column advanced steadily along the road, approximately 500 men moving in formation with military precision that would have surprised British officers who dismissed the provincials as undisciplined rabble. Major Buttrick, riding at the front with Colonel Barrett and Captain Davis, gave explicit orders. "Do not fire first, but prepare to defend yourselves." Captain Laurie ordered his men to fall back across the bridge to the east bank, a sound tactical decision that maintained his line of retreat toward Concord Center. However, in a fateful error, Laurie then ordered his soldiers to begin dismantling the bridge planking, an action that the approaching colonist could only interpret as hostile intent to trap them on the west side of the river. The morning of the 19th of April reached its crisis point at approximately 11 o'clock, as colonial militiamen approached the North Bridge's west bank, while British regulars occupied the eastern side. Captain Walter Laurie, commanding about 95 soldiers from the King's Own Regiment and other units, watched with growing alarm as the colonial column, now swollen to nearly 500 men, advanced within 100 yards of his position. The bridge itself, a simple wooden structure approximately 12 feet wide, became the physical threshold between the old colonial relationship with Britain and an uncertain revolutionary future. Major John Buttrick, commanding the colonial advance as they approached the bridge, understood the magnitude of what was about to occur. Unlike Lexington, where Parker's militia had been dispersed and defensive, the colonists at Concord were advancing in military formation with clear numerical superiority. This was not a confrontation they stumbled into. This was a deliberate military maneuver that could only be interpreted as rebellion against Crown authority. The British soldiers, exhausted from their overnight march and unnerved by the sight of so many armed colonists, began to show signs of poor discipline. Captain Laurie's men had been trained for European-style warfare, where armies faced each other in open fields with clear command structures and established protocols. This situation, occupying a narrow bridge with hostile forces on both banks and the threat of encirclement, was precisely the type of irregular warfare that conventional military training had not adequately prepared them for. As the colonists closed to within 50 yards, a single shot rang out from the British line, followed almost immediately by a disorganized volley. Unlike the relatively controlled British fire at Lexington, this discharge appeared to be unauthorized, triggered by panic rather than orders. Musket balls tore through the colonial ranks, killing Captain Isaac Davis instantly with a shot through the heart and mortally wounding Acton Private Abner Hosmer, who fell beside his captain. These were the first colonial casualties resulting from offensive military action rather than defensive dispersal. Major Buttrick, seeing his men fall, made a decision that Colonel Barrett had authorized him to make if British troops fired first. He shouted the order that severed colonial America from British rule more decisively than any political declaration could. "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." The colonial volley that followed was devastating in its effectiveness. Unlike the British soldiers, many of these militiamen were experienced hunters who fired their muskets regularly to provide food for their families. Their marksmanship proved far superior to the British regulars' parade ground training. 3 British soldiers fell dead, 1 private each from the King's Own Regiment, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and the 4th Regiment of Foot. 4 British officers were wounded, including Lieutenant Sutherland, who had commanded the patrol that captured Paul Revere the previous night. The psychological impact of this fire exceeded its physical damage. British regulars, the professional soldiers who had defeated French armies from India to Canada, were being driven back by American farmers. Captain Laurie, wounded and watching his command disintegrate, ordered a retreat toward Concord Center. What followed was not an orderly withdrawal, but an increasingly panicked flight. British soldiers abandoned their formation, leaving their dead and some of their wounded behind in their haste to escape the colonial fire. 1 wounded British soldier, left behind at the bridge, was discovered by a young colonial militiaman named Ammi White, who struck the dying soldier with a hatchet, an act that British propaganda would later characterize as colonial savagery, though historical evidence suggests White believed the soldier was already dead, or may have been defending himself from what he perceived as an attack. As the British soldiers fled back into Concord Center and reported their defeat to Lieutenant Colonel Smith, the scope of the disaster became apparent. Smith's command was now miles from Boston, running low on ammunition, facing an enemy whose numbers were growing by the hour, and worst of all, had suffered a tactical defeat that would embolden the colonists throughout Massachusetts. Smith made the only decision possible under the circumstances: abandon the search operation and begin the march back to Boston immediately. Around noon on the 19th of April, 1775, the British column formed up on Concord's main road and began their retreat. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, a competent but unimaginative officer, organized his force into a standard marching column with flanking parties deployed to protect against ambush. What Smith failed to appreciate was that his flankers, trained for European warfare, were largely ineffective against colonists who knew every stone wall, every hillock, every patch of woods along the route. The colonial commanders, Colonel Barrett, Major Buttrick, and officers from the growing number of militia companies converging on the area, made a strategic decision that demonstrated sophisticated military thinking. Rather than attempting to block the British retreat with a conventional defensive line that the regulars might break through, they would harass the column continuously along its entire route back to Boston, using the terrain to their advantage while minimizing colonial casualties. This tactical approach, sometimes called the running battle, has been analyzed extensively in military histories, including those published by the U.S. Army Center of Military History. The strategy required coordination among militia companies that had never trained together, communication across miles of countryside, an individual initiative from hundreds of militiamen, all elements that supposedly undisciplined colonial troops should have lacked. The afternoon of the 19th of April transformed the Battle Road, the roughly 16-mile route from Concord back toward Boston, into what one British officer would later describe as one continuous ambush. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith's column of approximately 700 British regulars began their retreat around 12:30 in the afternoon, maintaining military formation and professional demeanor despite the morning's setbacks. Within half an hour, that discipline would be tested beyond anything these soldiers had experienced in previous campaigns. The first serious engagement occurred at Merriam's Corner, approximately 1 mile east of Concord Center, where the road crossed a small bridge over a brook. Colonel James Barrett's militiamen, along with companies from Reading and Billerica that had just arrived, positioned themselves behind stone walls and buildings commanding the bridge approaches. As the British rear guard crossed the bridge, colonial muskets opened fire from multiple directions. British casualties began mounting immediately. Unlike conventional European warfare where armies exchanged volleys in open fields, this combat involved what military historians term irregular warfare, or what the British soldiers called fighting like Indians. The colonists fired from behind cover, withdrew when British flanking parties approached, then reappeared elsewhere along the road to fire again. This tactic frustrated every principle of conventional military doctrine that British officers had learned. The British attempted to respond with flanking companies, detachments of light infantry sent out from the main column to clear colonists from the high ground on either side of the road. This approach worked reasonably well for the first few miles, but the physical toll proved unsustainable. British soldiers, already exhausted from 12 hours of continuous marching, now had to sprint uphill in heavy woolen uniforms, weighted down with weapons and equipment under the April sun. Meanwhile, the colonial militiamen were fighting from familiar ground, could rotate fresh companies into the combat, and often fired from prepared positions before withdrawing. At Brooks Tavern and again at the Bloody Angle near the Hartwell Tavern, concentrated colonial fire tore through British ranks. Private Thomas Thorndike of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers later recalled that the rebels seemed to fire from behind every tree, every stone wall, every building. We never saw formed bodies of them, only the smoke from their muskets. This anonymous, dispersed enemy proved psychologically devastating for soldiers trained to face opposing armies across open fields. The British column's cohesion began deteriorating mile by mile. Wounded soldiers struggled to keep pace, knowing that falling behind likely meant death or capture. Officers found their commands increasingly ignored as exhausted soldiers focused solely on survival. The flanking companies, pushed beyond human endurance, began refusing to deploy or moving with sluggish reluctance. Smith himself was wounded in the thigh, but continued commanding from horseback. By the time the British column approached Lexington around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 hours into their march, the retreat had become a rout. Soldiers broke formation to sprint ahead, abandoned wounded comrades, and in some cases threw away their weapons to move faster. British officers later testified that the column was within minutes of complete disintegration, with soldiers on the verge of surrendering or scattering into the countryside, where they would have been hunted down by colonial militiamen. The British were saved by the arrival of reinforcements. General Thomas Gage, monitoring reports from Boston throughout the day, had dispatched a relief column commanded by Hugh Percy, Earl Percy, and a brigadier general in the British Army. Percy's 1st Brigade consisted of approximately 1,000 soldiers from elite regiments including the Royal Marines and the Welsh Fusiliers, along with 2 artillery pieces, 6-pound field guns that would prove decisive. Lord Percy had positioned his relief force on the high ground in Lexington around 2:30 in the afternoon. When Smith's shattered column staggered into view, Percy's fresh troops provided covering fire while the exhausted regulars collapsed on the ground, many too depleted to even seek water. British officers later described soldiers lying prostrate with their tongues hanging out, some weeping from exhaustion and trauma, others staring blankly as their bodies shut down from the physical and psychological strain. Percy, a 30-year-old aristocrat who despite his privileged background was proving to be a capable combat commander, allowed only a brief rest before ordering the combined force to continue the retreat. Percy understood that thousands of colonial militiamen were converging on the area, and remaining stationary invited encirclement. However, he now commanded a force of approximately 1,700 men. He had artillery support, and his troops were fresh enough to maintain discipline. The presence of artillery changed the tactical situation significantly. When colonial militiamen began gathering in threatening numbers, Percy would order his gunners to fire into their positions, not with solid shot that might miss individual soldiers, but with grape shot that spread deadly metal fragments across wide areas. The cannon fire, something the colonists had not previously faced that day, temporarily dispersed concentrations of militia and reminded the Americans that British military power remained formidable despite the day's setbacks. Percy also demonstrated more sophisticated tactical thinking than Smith had shown. Rather than maintaining a simple column formation, Percy organized his command into a hollow square, with the wounded and exhausted soldiers from Smith's original column protected in the center. Flanking companies were deployed more systematically, and Percy ordered buildings along the route to be cleared or burned if they provided cover for colonial snipers. The afternoon of the 19th of April grew late as Lord Percy's combined force, now numbering nearly 1,700 British soldiers, continued their fighting retreat through Monotony, modern-day Arlington, where the battle would reach its peak intensity. Percy's tactical innovations had stabilized the British position, but every mile closer to Boston brought the column through more densely populated areas where colonial resistance could operate more effectively from houses, barns, and taverns lining the road. The Monotony proved the bloodiest single location of the entire day's fighting. The town's geography favored the colonists. The main road ran through a narrow corridor lined with substantial buildings that provided excellent cover for ambush. Additionally, unlike the rural stretches between Concord and Lexington, Monotony's architecture allowed large numbers of militiamen to concentrate in relatively small areas. Companies from throughout Massachusetts had been converging on the battle road all afternoon, and by the time Percy's column entered Monotony around 4:30, colonial forces may have numbered between 3,000 and 4,000 men. The fighting in Monotony descended into brutal close-quarters combat. British soldiers, frustrated by hours of invisible enemies and mounting casualties, began conducting what would today be termed aggressive clearance operations of buildings along their route. When musket fire erupted from a house, British troops would storm the building and kill everyone inside, combatants and non-combatants alike. The rules of conventional European warfare, which generally protected civilians who remained neutral, collapsed in the chaos of this running battle. At Cooper's Tavern, owned by Benjamin Cooper, colonial militiamen fired from the windows into British ranks. British soldiers burst into the tavern and killed all occupants, including Jason Russell, a 58-year-old who had ignored his wife's pleas to flee to safety. Russell's house became the site of some of the day's most intense fighting, with multiple colonists and British soldiers dying in the enclosed spaces of rooms and hallways. The archaeology of the Russell house, excavated and studied by historical preservation organizations, has revealed musket balls embedded in walls and bloodstains in the floorboards, physical evidence of the day's violence. British casualties mounted steadily. Sergeant Thomas Bishop of the King's Own Regiment wrote in his journal that the rebels were so concealed that we could see very few of them, yet our men were continually falling. The psychological strain of fighting an enemy who remained largely invisible, combined with physical exhaustion and the trauma of seeing comrades killed or wounded, pushed British soldiers toward breaking points. Some soldiers refused orders to clear buildings. Others fired wildly in all directions without identifying specific targets. Unit cohesion, the foundation of 18th century military effectiveness, was fragmenting despite officers' desperate efforts to maintain discipline. The colonial militiamen, meanwhile, were operating with increasing effectiveness despite having no unified command structure. Individual company commanders made tactical decisions based on local conditions, where to position their men, when to fire, when to withdraw and reposition. This decentralized leadership, which would have been a catastrophic weakness in conventional battle, proved ideally suited to the running fight along the battle road. Fresh companies could enter combat while exhausted units withdrew to rest, creating a continuously rotating engagement that maintained pressure on the British without exposing colonial forces to devastating return fire. Captain John Parker and the remnants of his Lexington militia company, the same men who had been fired upon that morning on Lexington Green, positioned themselves at a stone wall near the Lexington-Menotomy border. When Percy's column passed their position, Parker's company opened fire, exacting a measure of revenge for their fallen comrades. The precision of Parker's men, many of them wounded from the morning's engagement but still fighting, impressed even British officers who witnessed the ambush. Lord Percy, directing operations from horseback despite being personally targeted by colonial marksmen throughout the afternoon, made another crucial decision as his column approached the outskirts of Menotomy. He would not continue directly toward Boston via Cambridge as originally planned. Percy had received intelligence that colonial forces had destroyed the bridge over the Charles River on that route, which would trap his command with the river at their backs and thousands of militiamen pressing from the west. Instead, Percy ordered a turn toward Charlestown, a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow neck that could be defended with his artillery. This decision, made under extreme pressure with incomplete information, likely saved the British force from complete disaster. The route through Cambridge would have channeled Percy's column into an increasingly narrow corridor, where colonial forces could have brought overwhelming firepower to bear. The Charlestown route, while longer, provided more tactical flexibility and ended at a defensible position under the protection of British naval guns from warships in Boston Harbor. The running battle continued through Menotomy and into Cambridge Farms, now Somerville. British soldiers, many now operating on pure adrenaline after 16 hours of continuous physical exertion, maintained their retreat despite catastrophic losses. The 6-pound field guns that Percy had brought proved their worth repeatedly, with cannons firing grapeshot into concentrations of colonial militia. The distinctive boom of artillery, rarely heard in colonial America, reminded the militiamen that British military power remained dangerous even in defeat. As the British column approached Charlestown Neck around sunset, the firing gradually diminished. Colonial commanders, aware that British naval vessels could bombard militia positions on the peninsula, held their men back from pursuing into Charlestown proper. The British force, battered and depleted but still intact as a military unit, crossed onto the peninsula and established defensive positions on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, the same heights that would become famous 2 months later in the Battle of Bunker Hill. The evening of the 19th of April, 1775, fell across Massachusetts with British soldiers entrenched on Charlestown Peninsula and colonial militiamen occupying the mainland heights surrounding Boston. What had begun 16 hours earlier as a British punitive expedition to destroy military supplies had transformed into a colonial military campaign that had driven the most powerful army in the world back to their fortifications. The day's combat had fundamentally altered the relationship between Great Britain and her American colonies. There would be no peaceful resolution now, no diplomatic compromise that could erase the blood spilled along the battle road. Lord Percy's exhausted soldiers collapsed in the defensive positions they had established on the Charlestown Heights. Many fell asleep immediately despite the cool evening air, their bodies simply shutting down after the physical and psychological trauma of the retreat. British officers conducted a grim accounting of casualties. 73 soldiers killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, presumed dead or captured. These numbers, while modest compared to later Revolutionary War battles, represented approximately 15% of the total British force engaged and indicated a military defeat that could not be disguised by official reports. The wounded presented particularly difficult challenges. 18th-century military medicine was primitive by modern standards, with surgeons possessing limited understanding of infection, no anesthesia beyond alcohol or opiates, and no antibiotics. Soldiers with abdominal wounds or shattered limbs faced agonizing deaths over the following days and weeks. The British medical services, designed to support conventional campaigns where wounded could be evacuated to established hospitals, proved inadequate for treating hundreds of casualties in a besieged garrison. British officers began compiling reports for General Thomas Gage, and eventually for the Ministry in London, attempting to explain how a routine search and destroy operation had resulted in military catastrophe. Lieutenant John Barker of the King's Own Regiment wrote in his diary that, "Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself very mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about, having been employed as rangers against the Indians and Canadians." This acknowledgement that colonial forces possessed genuine military capabilities contradicted British assumptions about American military inferiority. Across the water in Boston, General Gage faced strategic decisions that would shape the next phase of the conflict. The British garrison in Boston, numbering approximately 4,000 soldiers, was now effectively under siege. The narrow neck connecting Boston to the mainland could be easily blocked by colonial forces, cutting off overland access. British control of the harbor and naval superiority provided supply lines from Halifax and Britain, but Gage's army was now confined to a city increasingly hostile to their presence. Meanwhile, throughout Massachusetts, the alarm system that had proven so effective on the 19th continued spreading news of the day's events to more distant communities. Express riders carried reports into Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and eventually throughout all 13 colonies. The accounts varied in accuracy. Some described British atrocities that had not occurred, others minimized colonial casualties or exaggerated British losses, but the essential message remained consistent. Colonial militiamen had faced British regulars in combat and had driven them from the field. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress, meeting in emergency session, immediately recognized that the colony was now in open rebellion against Crown authority. They dispatched urgent appeals for support to other colonies, while simultaneously working to transform the militia companies that had fought on the 19th into something resembling an organized army. The challenge was immense. Militia were traditionally short-term forces, with soldiers expected to serve briefly, then return to their farms and shops. Creating an army capable of sustained operations required addressing questions of command structure, supply, payment, discipline, and strategic objectives. Dr. Joseph Warren, who had sent Paul Revere and William Dawes on their midnight rides, emerged as a key political leader in the post-battle period. Warren recognized that controlling the narrative of the 19th's events would be crucial for maintaining colonial unity and potentially securing foreign support. He supervised the collection of sworn depositions from colonial witnesses to the day's events, creating an official record that portrayed British forces as the aggressors who had fired first at both Lexington and Concord. These depositions, while not entirely objective, were rushed to London by fast ship to present the colonial version of events before official British reports could arrive. The casualty figures for colonial forces remained uncertain in the immediate aftermath, with different towns compiling their own lists of dead and wounded. Modern historical research, synthesized in sources such as the work of historian J.L. Bell published through various academic institutions, establishes that 49 colonial militiamen were killed on the 19th, with another 39 wounded and 5 listed as missing. The dead came from throughout Massachusetts, from Acton and Woburn, from Bedford and Billerica, from Lynn and Dedham and a dozen other towns. Each death left a family grieving and a community determined to avenge their loss. Among the colonial dead was James Hayward of Acton, who encountered a British soldier at a water source during the retreat. According to local tradition, Hayward and the British soldier, both dying of thirst, approached the same spring simultaneously. The soldier allegedly said, "You are a dead man," to which Hayward replied, "And so are you." They fired simultaneously, killing each other, a grim vignette capturing the personal tragedy beneath the larger historical narrative. Whether this story is precisely accurate or embellished in retelling, it appears in multiple contemporary accounts and illustrates how the day's events were immediately being incorporated into local memory and mythology. The political impact of the 19th extended far beyond Massachusetts. When news reached Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress, scheduled to convene in May, suddenly had an entirely different mission. Rather than debating petitions and trade boycotts, the Congress would need to address the reality of open warfare and determine whether the 13 colonies would unite in supporting Massachusetts' resistance. The military situation around Boston had created political facts that made reconciliation with Britain increasingly difficult. The weeks following the 19th of April, 1775, witnessed the events of that day rippling outward through colonial America, across the Atlantic to Britain, and eventually to the courts and capitals of Europe. The battle, for it was now universally termed a battle rather than a skirmish or incident, served as a catalyst transforming colonial grievances into revolutionary action and forcing both sides to confront the possibility of extended military conflict. In Boston, General Thomas Gage found himself in an untenable strategic position. His garrison controlled the city proper, but was essentially besieged by thousands of colonial militiamen who had assembled on the surrounding heights. The British held overwhelming advantages in artillery, military training, and logistical support from the Royal Navy, but Gage understood that his force was insufficient to conduct offensive operations against an aroused countryside, while simultaneously maintaining control of Boston. He wrote to London requesting massive reinforcements, warning that subduing the rebellion would require not thousands, but tens of thousands of additional troops. The British government's response, when it finally came after the 6 to 8 weeks required for transatlantic communication, would commit Britain to military reconquest of the colonies. King George III, upon learning of the events of the 19th, allegedly declared that the colonists must either submit or triumph, rejecting any middle path of compromise. Parliament authorized the deployment of additional regiments to America and began hiring German mercenary troops, the Hessians who would become infamous in American memory, to supplement British forces. Colonial response to the battle proved remarkably unified, despite the 13 colonies' traditional divisions and rivalries. The Second Continental Congress, convening in Philadelphia on the 10th of May, 1775, received detailed reports of the 19th's events from Massachusetts delegates including John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams. The Congress faced profound questions. Would they support Massachusetts in what was clearly rebellion against Crown authority? Would they create a unified colonial military force? Would they seek reconciliation with Britain or pursue independence? The Congress's initial response demonstrated both unity and caution. On the 14th of June, 1775, the delegates voted to adopt the militia forces besieging Boston as the Continental Army, transforming what had been a Massachusetts rebellion into a unified colonial military effort. The following day, Congress appointed George Washington of Virginia as commanding general, a choice carefully calculated to bind the southern colonies to what had begun as a New England conflict. Washington, a wealthy planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, brought military experience, physical presence, and most importantly, the symbolic commitment of the largest and most populous colony to the common cause. Washington departed Philadelphia for Boston on the 23rd of June, 1775, and arrived to take command on the 2nd of July. What he found appalled him. The militia army besieging Boston numbered perhaps 15,000 men, but they were organized into separate colonial contingents with different terms of service, varying levels of equipment, and no unified command structure. Sanitation in the camps was primitive, discipline was lax, and officers were often elected by their men rather than appointed based on military competence. Washington immediately set about transforming this armed mob into something resembling a professional army, a task that would consume his energies for the next 8 years. The strategic situation around Boston remained essentially static through the summer and fall of 1775. British forces controlled the city and harbor, while colonial forces controlled the surrounding territory. Neither side possessed the capability or will to force a decisive engagement. This stalemate would not break until March 1776, when Continental Army artillery positioned on Dorchester Heights forced a British evacuation of Boston. But that outcome lay months in the future from the perspective of late April 1775. The propaganda war over the battle's meaning began immediately and continued for generations. Colonial newspapers published accounts emphasizing British aggression, describing regulars firing on peaceful citizens, burning homes, and bayoneting wounded men. These accounts, while containing kernels of truth, often exaggerated British atrocities for political effect. British reports, conversely, emphasized colonial treachery, describing rebels who fired from ambush without warning, violated flags of truce, and mutilated British wounded. Both sides sought to portray themselves as victims forced into violence by their opponent's aggression. The testimony compiled by Dr. Joseph Warren and other colonial leaders proved particularly effective in shaping international opinion. Warren's committee collected 94 depositions from colonial participants and witnesses, creating a documentary record that reached London before General Gage's official dispatches. This Massachusetts version of events portrayed the British as aggressors who had fired first at both Lexington and Concord, massacred peaceable citizens, and then been justly driven from the field by outraged colonists defending their rights and property. While historians continue debating details of who fired first and when, Warren's propaganda campaign successfully established the colonial narrative as the dominant interpretation in much of Europe. In Britain, reaction to news of the 19th divided largely along existing political lines. Government supporters, led by Lord North's ministry and backed by King George III, portrayed the battle as evidence that colonial radicals had forced a military confrontation, and that only firm military action could restore order. Opposition figures, including Edmund Burke and William Pitt the Elder, argued that ministerial tyranny had driven loyal British subjects to desperate resistance and that conciliation rather than coercion offered the only path to preserving the empire. These debates in Parliament reflected deeper questions about the nature of British imperial governance and the rights of subjects living thousands of miles from London. European powers watched the developing conflict with intense interest. France, defeated by Britain in the 7 Years' War barely a decade earlier, saw potential opportunity in British troubles with her colonies. French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, began exploring how France might benefit from British distraction in America, though overt French support for the colonies lay years in the future. Spain, also defeated by Britain in the previous war, shared France's interest in seeing British power diminished but worried that supporting colonial rebellion might inspire similar movements in Spain's own American empire. The battle's impact on colonial society proved profound and lasting. Communities throughout Massachusetts mourned their dead while simultaneously celebrating what many viewed as a glorious victory over professional soldiers. The 50 killed and wounded became instant martyrs and heroes, their names recorded on monuments and preserved in local histories. Widows and orphans of the slain petitioned colonial authorities for support, beginning a pattern that would continue throughout the Revolutionary War of civilian casualties, creating social obligations for government relief. The 19th of April also accelerated political and social changes already underway in colonial society. Traditional deference to authority, whether royal governors, wealthy merchants, or established clergy, eroded as ordinary farmers and artisans who had fought along the battle road claimed new social and political status. Men like Captain John Parker, dying of tuberculosis but fighting to his last breath, embodied a republican virtue that challenged older hierarchical social arrangements. The battle created a generation of colonial veterans who would demand political rights commensurate with their military service. The years following the 19th of April, 1775, would transform that day's events from immediate military crisis into foundational American mythology. Yet the battle's historical significance extends beyond patriotic commemoration to encompass profound questions about revolution, rights, and the relationship between citizens and government. The shots fired at Lexington Green and Concord's North Bridge represented not merely the beginning of a military conflict, but the violent birth of ideas about popular sovereignty and individual liberty that would reshape the Atlantic world. The immediate military consequences of the battle proved significant, but not decisive. British forces remained in Boston until March 1776, when Continental Army artillery on Dorchester Heights forced their evacuation. The war would continue for 7 more years, with major campaigns shifting from New England to New York, then to the southern colonies, before culminating in British surrender at Yorktown in October 1771. Approximately 25,000 American soldiers and militia would die during the Revolutionary War, along with tens of thousands of British and German soldiers and uncounted civilians caught in the conflict's path. The casualties of the 19th of April represented less than 1% of the war's total toll, Yet that day's event set in motion the chain of escalation that made all subsequent deaths possible. The political transformation proved even more significant than the military outcome. On the 4th of July, 1776, 15 months after the battle, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, formally severing ties with Great Britain and proclaiming the existence of the United States of America. That declaration's most famous passage, asserting that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, articulated principles that the Minutemen of April 1775 had defended without fully expressing. The connection between the battle and the Declaration is direct. The bloodshed along the battle road made reconciliation with Britain politically and psychologically impossible, forcing colonial leaders to embrace full independence. The anniversary of the 19th of April became one of the new nation's most important commemorative dates. Towns along the battle road erected monuments to their fallen, creating sacred sites of national memory. Lexington's monument to the 8 militiamen killed on the Green, dedicated in 1835, bears Captain Parker's legendary command: "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Concord's monument at the North Bridge, topped with Daniel Chester French's iconic Minuteman statue unveiled in 1875, commemorates the colonists who fired the shot heard round the world. These monuments and the ceremonies surrounding them served multiple purposes beyond simple commemoration. They constructed a narrative of the Revolution emphasizing unity, sacrifice, and the defense of liberty against tyranny. This narrative, while based on historical events, often simplified or ignored complexities such as the reality that many colonists remained loyal to Britain, that enslaved African Americans and Native Americans experienced the Revolution very differently than white colonists, and that the militiamen of April 1775 were defending their interpretation of rights as British subjects rather than consciously creating a new nation. Modern historical scholarship, drawing on sources ranging from Revolutionary-era manuscripts housed at institutions like the Massachusetts Historical Society to archaeological investigations of battle sites, has enriched our understanding of the 19th's events while complicating simple heroic narratives. Historians have documented the complexity of colonial motivations, economic concerns about British taxation mixed with constitutional principles about representation, local autonomy balanced against desires for British military protection, and ideological commitments to liberty coexisting with social systems that enslaved thousands. The battle emerges from this scholarship not as a simple story of heroes versus villains, but as a tragic breakdown of political negotiation into violence that both sides claimed to regret, even as they prosecuted it with increasing ferocity. The international legacy of the 19th of April and the broader American Revolution proved transformative. The successful colonial rebellion against British rule inspired revolutionary movements throughout the Atlantic world. French revolutionaries in 1789 explicitly invoked American precedents when overthrowing their monarchy. Latin American independence movements in the early 19th century looked to the United States as a model, though they often struggled to replicate its success. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, independence movements and popular revolutions have cited the American Revolution as justification for their own rebellions against established authority. The ideological legacy remains equally significant and contested. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, popular sovereignty, natural rights, government by consent, became foundational to American political identity and influenced democratic movements worldwide. Yet the gap between those principles and American reality, particularly regarding slavery, women's rights, and the treatment of Native Americans, created tensions that persist into the present. The Minutemen who fought on the 19th of April believed they were defending traditional rights, yet their actions helped unleash forces that would radically transform society in ways they neither anticipated nor necessarily desired. The battle road itself became a historic landscape preserved for future generations. In 1959, the U.S. Congress established Minuteman National Historical Park, protecting portions of the route British soldiers traveled and the sites where colonists fought and died. The park serves educational purposes, hosting hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, who walk the same ground where Lieutenant Colonel Smith's column retreated under fire, and where Minutemen like Isaac Davis gave their lives. The physical preservation of battlefields and historic structures allows modern Americans to connect viscerally with events that might otherwise remain abstract historical facts. The 19th of April, 1775, stands as one of history's pivotal days when accumulated tensions exploded into violence that neither side could contain or control. The British soldiers who marched from Boston that morning expected a routine operation to confiscate military supplies. The colonial militiamen who assembled on Lexington Green and at Concord's North Bridge intended to defend what they viewed as their constitutional rights as Englishmen. Neither side anticipated that their confrontation would ignite a war lasting 8 years, creating a new nation that would eventually become a global superpower and spreading revolutionary ideas that would reshape political systems across the globe. 250 years later, the legacy of that April day continues shaping American identity and political culture. The image of citizen soldiers leaving their plows to defend liberty against tyranny remains central to how Americans understand themselves and their history. The Minuteman statue at Concord's North Bridge, a farmer grasping his musket, determined yet reluctant to fight, embodies ideals of civic virtue and individual responsibility that continue resonating in contemporary political debates. Whether those ideals can address the complexities of modern governance remains an open question, but their origins can be traced directly to the morning of the 19th of April, 1775, when ordinary men made extraordinary choices that changed the world. The shot fired on Lexington Green, whoever actually pulled that trigger truly was heard round the world, not because of its immediate military impact, but because of what it set in motion. 8 British years of warfare, the creation of a new form of government based on republican principles, the gradual expansion of rights to previously excluded groups, and the ongoing struggle to fulfill the revolution's promise of liberty and justice, all flow from that moment when peaceful resistance transformed into armed rebellion. The Battle of Lexington and Concord was not merely the first engagement of the American Revolution. It was the violent birth of ideas about human freedom and government by consent that continue shaping our world centuries later.